So, not too long ago, this summer actually, I decided to go on a big diet. And I actually got down from this starting physique that you see on screen right now, and I got all the way down to this, what is in my opinion, shredded 173 pounds, give or take. 21-ish pounds, getting down to what for me is probably one of the leanest body fat percentages that I have ever had. And I got a lot of comments from you guys, but there was one in particular that I thought was interesting. How many times did it take you to get ripped? Meaning, were there multiple attempts when you attempted to get ripped and just didn't make it? And the answer to this is yes, actually. Way back before this YouTube channel even existed in my early 20s, there were times, multiple years in fact, especially back in college, when I set my eyes on doing a diet, and then after a few weeks or maybe even a month or two, I would fail. I would get discouraged, it didn't seem to be working, or it was simply put too hard. I would give up and say, screw it, I'll try again next year. So without further ado, here is 10. Actually, I ended up cutting this down to 8 while editing, so let's just... there we go. Things that I incorrectly did or incorrectly assumed when I was younger, which resulted in me failing on my diets time after time. And essentially, here's a good list of what not to do if you actually want to succeed. The first and probably the most important thing, it was that I started to visually feel and look smaller, and I started to panic that like, oh, I'm losing all the muscle that I spent years, building. I've actually talked about this very concept in previous videos. I even have a name for it. I call this the weight loss paradox. Usually, we're always told that when we lean down, we should look better, right? Because now we're stripping away the layer of subcutaneous fat we have on our body, and thus we should have more muscle separation. We should look leaner, and in addition, we should also kind of look a little bit bigger due to the like optical illusion of bodybuilding, right? Well, that doesn't happen. Actually, not in the first month or two. Eventually, yeah, it does. And guess what? It's fucking awesome, because even though you're down 20-25 pounds, you look incredible. But in the beginning, the first month or two, again, when so many people like myself in the past kind of get demotivated and quit, it's actually sort of the opposite. And the best way to kind of explain why this happens is it's sort of the exact opposite of what bodybuilders do. You'll see a lot of bodybuilders the day before, or especially the morning of the show, taking in a lot of kind of like simple carbohydrates. Sometimes even backstage guys are eating like candies and chocolate bars and stuff like that. The reason they do this is because they are so depleted, usually from a carbohydrate standpoint. They are trying to get an influx of quick carbs into their muscles to replenish glycogen storage, which is going to essentially what we call filling out. It's going to help inflate your muscles a little bit and make you look a little bigger. The problem is that's carbing up. When you're doing the opposite, carbing down, especially in the first few weeks, it's essentially the reverse of this. A lot of guys become essentially like you are depleting glycogen stores to a certain level. You are losing a significant amount of water weight because water actually has a high affinity for binding to glycogen in our bodies, specifically in our liver and our muscles, and because of this, we start to look a little deflated. And this sucks because you were simultaneously like dieting down to look better, but you're not really getting that much leaner yet because you haven't actually gotten really tapped into your fat stores, but you are simultaneously getting smaller. And this is a shitty feeling to experience, which is what I did, which is what kind of scared me when I looked in the mirror, and then I just freaked out and I would quit. So my biggest advice to any of you guys out there who are kind of experiencing this, don't worry, trust the process. If you can get over that initial hump, those first few weeks and you kind of start to feel like you're almost deflating a little bit, eventually, once you actually really start ripping into your fat stores and you actually start getting a noticeable decrease in body fat level and you actually start leaning out, seeing additional separation, vascularity, muscle definition, all this stuff, then it will be the opposite. At that point, every pound you lose, it's almost as if you're gaining a pound just visually. You're getting smaller, but you're looking bigger, and then the end result is something like this. This was the smallest I have been in like 3 years, but coincidentally, visually, I almost looked the biggest. And also, don't get me wrong, I may use myself as an example, but this still applies for regular everyday people who aren't trying to get down to competition sub 10% body fat levels. If you're someone just trying to lose an extra 10, 15 pounds, maybe go from like, I don't know, 25% body fat to 20 or like 15% body fat, this still 100% applies regardless. I just like to use myself as an example because it's a bit more of an obvious and almost exaggerated example. So yeah, I know it kind of sucks, but if you can kind of get over this mental barrier, this mental hump, and accept the fact that temporarily you might kind of start to feel a little smaller, if you can get over that hump and keep pushing, eventually it's pretty much going to be the exact opposite, at least from a visual standpoint. This video is sponsored by Let's Get Checked. Let's Get Checked is a fast and inexpensive service that provides health blood tests you can do from the privacy of your own home. There are a multitude of things you can test for, such as hormone levels, micronutrients, cholesterol, even certain STDs, all in the privacy of your own home. This way, if, God forbid, something comes back with concerning results, you will have a much better idea of what you may want to look into a bit more, maybe some lifestyle changes you may want to incorporate, and most importantly, what you may want to speak to your doctor about in the near future. And they gave me a promo code. So right now, you guys can get 25% off your entire order using code VitruvianPhysique. So whether it's because there is something you are concerned about, or you just want to get a better idea of what's happening in your own body, check out Let's Get Checked using the link in the description box below. I remember I would start losing weight in the first few weeks of my diet, and it was awesome, I gotta be honest. I would be dropping weight like 2 pounds per week, which for a guy my size is pretty much the upper level of the target fat loss range. And eventually, after, 4 or 5 weeks, it would kind of slow down. And then after another 4 or 5 weeks, it would kind of slow down again, despite the fact that I was still working just as hard and eating just as clean and just as many calories and carbs. And so I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? Is it just not working? Is my body, reached a starvation mode? It would get demotivating, and again, it would get too hard and I would quit because I thought, well, that's it. I guess I just can't do it and it's not working anymore. The problem is that people erroneously believe that what works for them on day 1 or even month 1 is going to continue working for them on months 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on how long you want to do it. When in reality, that's really not the case. Fat loss is not a static process for the majority of people. It is sort of dynamic in the sense that the certain variables, the situation that you're in on day 1 might be, I was going to say vastly different. It's not that vast, but it is somewhat different on days 30, 60, 90, wherever you are. This is because your metabolism is going to a certain extent, adapt. And although you might have been in a sufficient calorie deficit in the beginning, as your metabolism comes down, that calorie deficit comes down as well to the point where it's much smaller or essentially non-existent compared to where it used to be. Now, as to why this occurs, there's a multitude of reasons. Number one is that you're physically a smaller person than you were when you started dieting, and thus your metabolism is going to go down. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you do those metabolic calculations. One of the variables they ask you for is, what is your body weight? Well, the problem is if your body weight goes down, you're changing a variable, then your output, the actual metabolism level you initially calculated, that's going to go down as well. Another factor is NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just a very sciencey and overly fancy way of saying everything you do throughout the day that is physically gonna, burn calories that isn't conscious exercise. Even me, like this. What I'm doing right now, this is an example of NEAT, because I am kind of subconsciously doing this random non-exercise movement, but yes, at the end of the day, every time I do this, it burns like 0.1 calories, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you factor in everything that you do throughout the day, which qualifies as NEAT, it adds up to a pretty decent amount. And our bodies subconsciously decrease this level, the levels of NEAT, once we have been dieting for a while, because it doesn't realize that you're dieting. It thinks you're dying, it thinks you're starving on a deserted island somewhere, and it's doing everything in its power to preserve yourself, decrease your metabolism, because it thinks that you're starving and living off of like bananas and coconuts and sand. And so unfortunately, although this may kind of suck, and I'm pretty sure you guys are hoping I have a magical solution for this, the secret is, if you want to avoid these fat loss plateaus, you need carb cycling or intermittent fasting or frigging magic gurus, fortune teller shit. No, that's all nice, that's all bonuses, but at the end of the day, you can't outrun simple thermodynamics. If you're not losing weight, it's because, assuming you're sticking to your diet, it's because you are not in a calorie deficit. Maybe you were following this strategy on day one, but again, as things dynamically change over 1, 2, 3 months, maybe today, you no longer are. And you're gonna have to make some changes, which essentially come out to, as usual, just getting more aggressive in terms of decreasing calories, increasing activity level, whether it be lifestyle or cardio, or ideally, some combination of both. Next up is trying to eat too clean. When I first started, I kind of like watched a lot of those like old school bodybuilders who just sat there living on like, it was like chicken, rice, like tilapia, just mountains of this like plain ass whitefish, which tastes like the embodiment of what I would expect water to taste like in solid form. And I thought, okay, if it works for them, I'm gonna do it too. I'm not gonna even smell an Oreo or lick a French fry. Screw that. I'm 100% clean. And I did that, and the weight loss was fucking great for 3 weeks before I started to lose my mind, because unfortunately this was a completely unsustainable diet model. I've always talked about how realistically, practically speaking, probably the ratio between like healthy, clean, whole foods and junk, a reasonable amount is probably like 80-20, maybe like 70-30, right? Notice that it is not 100-0, even though that would be fantastic from a health standpoint, because usually whole foods are much better in terms of their micronutrient profile, in terms of their fiber content, in terms of their like amount of processed high glycemic index carbohydrates, which usually kind of don't make you feel all that great. But at the end of the day, either situation, perfectly clean or 100% junk, both are realistically unsustainable, and I do not recommend them. It's kind of like your job, right? You go to the office or you do whatever you do, probably for a reasonable amount of time, right? 7, 6, 8 hours, something like that. Nobody's working, usually, unless they're very lucky, nobody's working 2 hours a week or 14 hours a day. The majority of us can't do either of these situations. This one, that like I barely work, is kind of like eating junk all the time. That's great. Probably not gonna work. You're gonna end up fat, or in the case of the guy who's working 2 hours a week, most of us are gonna end up dead ass broke. But the guy who's busting his ass working 14 hours a week or eating 100% super clean, you're gonna go crazy. You're gonna put a bullet in your head. It's not sustainable. I would much rather you do a 7 out of 10 diet that you can stick to for 3, 4, 5 months, however long you need to get to your end goal, as opposed to the world's best perfect 10 out of 10 diet where you live off nothing but tuna fish, salad, and spinach, but you're only able to do that for 2 to 3 weeks before you go crazy and end up quitting. Just like I did, it's just not feasible for 99% of us. Next up is the unfortunate inevitability for not all, but many of us, which is that your strength is going to go down. It's at least, if it's not going to go down in terms of how strong you actually are, the progression of your strength is going to slow down because you're in a calorie deficit. I mean, it sounds fancy, but at the end of the day, what is a calorie deficit? It's an energy deficit. It's like you trying to go 500 miles in a car on half a tank of gas. Probably not going to happen, and probably not going to go as far as you did it last time before, when you had a full tank of gas, when you weren't dieting, when you were eating enough, when you were bulking. I mean, that is overall a much more optimal environment, conducive to actually being able to retain muscle and strength, let alone put on muscle and strength. Now, some people are going to be able to do this. Usually it's people who are on anabolic steroids, or people who are kind of newer to training. It's very important to evaluate yourself where you are on the law of diminishing returns muscle kind of like chart. So the more years you train, the harder and harder it is to make more gains and faster gains, more strength, more muscle, everything, because essentially your body's becoming somewhat desensitized to training in the first place. So same applies to retaining and building muscle and strength when you are dieting down. If you are someone who is like 5 years in, or in my case, 15 years in, chances are it's going to be kind of hard for you to maintain, let alone build muscle and strength in a calorie deficit. Again, it is a very, very suboptimal catabolic environment. Now, if you're someone who's kind of newer to training, I've worked with a lot of people who can continue to do so, just because it is such a new stimulus that is able to overtake the fact that you are technically in a calorie deficit, the fact that you are technically in an energy deficit, again, not a great situation from a strength gain or maintenance standpoint. Another big factor is simply the fact that strength is so much a skill as it is a product of just raw contractile muscle tissue. That's a big reason why a lot of like Olympic lifters are able to get stronger and later into their careers, despite the fact that they can't get that big. They can't just put on muscle because then they're going to be taken out of their weight category. How do you do that? You do so by developing the skill of the lift, developing those motor unit, those motor neural pathways, being able to recruit more muscle fibers in synchronization more efficiently, more effectively, allowing you to lift more weight than you previously were able to do so, despite the fact that you technically don't have that much more muscle. This is something a lot of people forget. Muscle gain is a great way to put on strength, but it's not the only way to put on strength. You know, strength in like a bench or deadlift or squat is as much a skill as it is in other things like a jump shot, skateboarding, golf, you name it. Eating way too much protein because, once again, like I've mentioned numerous times already in this video, I saw big bodybuilders doing it and I thought, hey, I need to do that as well. I remember eating upwards of 250 grams of protein per day. Number one, it was expensive as hell. Me being a broke college student was kind of more difficult. Number two, it wasn't enjoyable because eventually, I mean, like, listen, you're not eating delicious protein sources. I'm not sitting there eating like juicy, like AAA ribeye steaks. No, I'm eating chicken 3 times a day. Again, I'm not a very good cook because A, I don't want to cook elaborate meals 4 times a day. Plus, again, I was a dumb 21-year-old in college. Overall, it was expensive, it was difficult, and unfortunately, the third and most important thing is that it was unnecessary. A lot of studies have now confirmed that like 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight is in many cases more than enough, especially for people who are not in a calorie deficit. If you are in a calorie deficit, you might want to take it a little bit higher, but then also it depends on how lean you are. The longer you've been dieting, the leaner you are, the closer you are to single-digit body fat percentage, then yeah, probably 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, maybe even a little bit more, might be optimal. But if you're someone who is kind of like not some hardcore bodybuilder, you are someone who's got a decent amount of body fat to lose, who is relatively like new to this, chances are you don't need some crazy amount. I would say anything from around 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, even when you are dieting down, should be just fine. And also, this is for people we're talking about who are trying to lose some weight, but they're kind of average, 20% body fat, give or take. If you're someone who is a lot heavier, you can't really follow that because if you're 300 pounds, if you're obese, what are you going to be eating? 300 grams of protein? That's insane. Also, it's unnecessary. You don't have that much muscle to retain via protein, intake anyway. In those cases, usually a good rule of thumb is just 1 gram of protein per centimeter of body height. So if you're like 180 centimeters, that's like 5'11", give or take, 180 grams of protein on a daily basis for you should be more than enough. Even if you are dieting down and in a calorie deficit, which means that technically you do have a slightly more increased protein requirement. 9 times out of 10 when I talk to people, they're usually consuming more protein than they actually need to. Is it technically a problem? No, but it's going to make the overall process a bit more challenging. Partly is just the major fact that you are consuming more protein. Protein makes up a certain percentage of your calories, and thus more protein means to hit your target calories, you're gonna have to bring carbs and fat down. And if you're someone who's dieting down, what would you rather eat? Fruits, rice, potatoes, carbohydrates, or a 4th plain ass boring chicken breast per day? Okay, this next one I have talked about. I think I'm gonna talk about it on my channel at least once every year for the last 5 years, and I guess 2022, we are overdue. Incorrectly weighing yourself, which is going to result in you feeling either very demotivated at the lack of progress or overconfident in progress you think is there when in reality, it's not. A lot of people out there, and I deal with clients like all the time who do this. And the first thing when I start working with them, I'm like, you need to stop doing this. Let's say you take someone who only weighs themselves sporadically. Maybe there's somebody who's like, I weigh myself once a week to see if I'm on track with my diet. The problem is your body is going to fluctuate a dramatic amount, especially us men, especially bigger men. We could fluctuate as much as 3, 4, hell, even 5 pounds in as little as 12 hours, just due to things like body water levels, sodium intake, meal timing, fecal matter excretion, to be blunt, things like that. So the problem is you might weigh yourself randomly on like a Monday and it might be kind of overly high or kind of overly low. Regardless, it's not painting the actual picture of what is happening in your body, which again, it might lead to you being demotivated because you think, oh shit, my diet's not working. No, maybe it is. Maybe if you weighed yourself 7 days as opposed to one random day, you would realize that that one random day you weighed yourself was actually sort of an anomaly. Maybe you had a late dinner the night before. Maybe you had a lot of sodium. You had a big bowl of soup the night before, causing additional water retention. For women, their menstrual cycle is going to make a dramatic impact on this. This is kind of, again, the really good metaphor is the difference between weather and climate. Weather is all over the place. Right now, today, it was 20 degrees in Toronto in the middle of November. What the fuck? I mean, this is insane. Usually it's like 4 degrees and we got a foot of snow by now. This makes no sense. Climate is the overall average for, this geographical region, or in this case, the overall average for your body, ideally on a 7-day basis. And that is what I recommend to people. Number one, I really recommend that you weigh yourself at least every day. Number two, I recommend you weigh yourself in the exact same situation. Again, wake up in the morning, after the bathroom, before consuming any food, water, anything like that. Take a photo of it. That's what I used to do. Just take a photo of my scale with my phone. Write it down in a notepad on your phone. I don't care what you do. Get that data. And then at the end, get a 7-day average, and then compare, instead of day to day, compare week 1 average to week 2 average to week 3 average, and see, like, that way, am I losing weight? A really good way to kind of get around this, if you don't want to do it manually like I do in like friggin' Microsoft Excel, there's a really good app, Happy Scale. It does it for you. The app is free from what I understand. You just go into the app. Every day you type in your body weight. So I will literally weigh myself at like 9 a.m. or whenever I wake up. And then 10 seconds later, I just plug that weight into Happy Scale. And if you do this long enough, you start to develop a 7-day moving average. It's interesting. This is actually what stock traders do, like in investment banks. They do analysis on stocks. They do 7-day moving averages. And this kind of gives you a much more accurate representation of what's actually happening with the stock, or in this case with your body weight, as opposed to I weighed in at 9 a.m. on Monday, and then I weighed in at 3 p.m. on Thursday, and then I skipped the... Then you have messy data. It's got more holes in it than like a slice of Swiss cheese. Again, not a very good idea. So this is something which I think at this point a lot of people here on fitness have talked about 100 times, but seeing as there are still a lot of beginners, I think it's still very important to say it, even if this will be the 101th time I say it on the channel. And that was the mistake that, hell, even I made. Like, I was jacked. I was like 200 pounds. I had like a 450 deadlift. I was pretty buff by the average man's standard, but still, I made this mistake. I tried to spot reduce body fat, namely the age-old problem I have on my body, my legs, which are just the most stubborn body fat that I have anywhere else on my body by far. And I made the mistake of thinking, well, if I do more exercise specifically for that area, more frequent leg training, lots of cardio. So I did a lot of running, believing that, hey, if I move my legs, I'm going to activate and liberate more fat from the fat cells in the legs, right? No, not really. There are I have read a little bit of science indicating that might be slightly possible, but the extent to which this occurs is so small, it's essentially most likely it's negligible. Building muscle is like trying to build a house on a very large plot of land. Let's say that your body is the plot of land and it's like a football field. Wherever you put in the time, the energy, you put the materials, that is where the house is going to be. When it comes to body fat reduction, it's it's pretty much the exact opposite situation. It's kind of like trying to drain a pool. If you go to a pool and you try to drain just one corner, you take like a glass or a bucket and you take water out, what happens? Does that one section of the pool go down and everything else remain high? No, it doesn't work like that. The water level overall goes down a tiny fraction of an amount. That's sort of the case when it comes to body fat. You can't specifically spot reduce a certain area. One thing that is kind of annoying is because in this perfect analogy, if you were to reduce you were to take water out of the pool, your entire body would go down, so you wouldn't have any stubborn body fat areas, when in reality, you do. There are certain areas like my back, for example, which gets lean very easily, and my legs, which never get lean. So I guess in reality, a better metaphor would be a pool where there are certain deep areas. You've got the deep end and the shallow end. My back, that's kind of like the shallow end. It just genetically, for me, it gets lean very quickly, very easily. Whereas my legs, they're kind of the opposite. That's the deep end. That is the place where if you actually want to get to a point where the water level is low or gone, in this case a metaphor for body fat, I'm going to have to lose so much fat everywhere else on my body before finally my legs start to go down even a few body fat percentage points. And hell, I felt this myself just a few months ago when I competed, when I had a shredded back, pretty lean abs, and my legs, to be honest, they were still fatter than some guys out there just walking around, not even doing a competition prep. Does it suck? Yeah, but again, as I mentioned earlier in this video, if you don't like it, take it up with God or Mother Nature or realistically your parents, because those guys are the ones who gave you these genetics. And finally, fat burners, which I used to somewhat still kind of rely on and believe in incorrectly. I would say there are two different kind of like categories you can put them in. Number one is the legal, totally normal, standard stuff you see in most stores. I mean, you can find fat burners everywhere now, even like Walmart. And those usually, they don't really work all that well. I did a full, very detailed scientific analysis video into fat burners a couple years ago. If you guys are interested, go check out that. I'll leave a link somewhere around here. At the time of me doing that video, every other ingredient I looked into, commonly used ingredients in fat burners, there was very little, if any, scientific evidence actually supporting it. And to be frank, in many cases, it does nothing more than burn a $60 hole in your wallet. Category 2 is the stuff that actually works. But there are other, and in my opinion, bigger problems associated with this, which in my opinion drastically overshadow whatever positive effects they may have on your metabolism and overall fat loss. These are in many cases illegal substances, performance-enhancing drugs. We're talking powerful pharmaceutical thermogenics. Things like clenbuterol is a popular drug used by competitive bodybuilders. But there's also some other substances which are not illegal, and they might work, but you just feel like such dog shit that in my opinion, it's not worth it. And I actually experienced this myself a few months ago when I decided to give one of these a try. Again, I'm not someone who is completely against all fat burners entirely and I think it's cheating or it's bullshit. I'm just like, no, either they don't work or they're not worth it. I'm always open to looking at new research or maybe even giving one of them a try, which is what I did with Rollicine, which is actually a derivative of yohimbine, which is a common old school fat loss supplement. And to be honest, I don't know if it actually worked for me because I never got to a point where I did it long enough to see any results because I felt like shit. And not for just 20 or 30 minutes after I take it. No, it was like 6 hours. I was still so jittery and feeling so anxious and shaky that I couldn't do anything with my life. Whether it be fitness, work, even social events. Like I couldn't even sit there and watch a movie. At that point, I would rather just go and do an extra 20-minute walk or a jog, burn a bit more calories just through cardio, and then spend the next 5.5 hours enjoying my life as opposed to taking this pill and spending 6 hours sitting there feeling like I'm gonna drop dead at any moment because my heart rate is 200 and I'm sweaty and I'm anxious and overall, in my opinion, just not worth it. So essentially, this entire point in the video can be summarized that fat loss supplements for the majority of people, in my opinion, are either just not going to do anything, or if they are, they're going to do a whole lot of other crap, which makes it, again, just overall not worth it. at least in my opinion, from the fat loss supplements that I have researched and looked into. If anybody out there can find a new magic one on the horizon that totally changes my mind, please share it with me because I would be all for it. And guys, that really, for me, at least in my personal situation, that's about it. I did this like 2 years in a row. 3rd year of university, 4th year of university, and I think maybe the year after that, I didn't actually have a legit, real, successful diet until I was 23 years old. That was the first time I did my first ever bodybuilding competition, when I got from 200 pounds all the way down to like 178, give or take. But hopefully, if you can learn through my mistakes, hopefully you won't need 3 or 4 years of trial and error before you actually finally learn how to diet the way I did, which is unfortunately, again, something that I took a few years to figure out. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you. If you like this video, make sure to actually like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.